The blood on Sarah Sullivan's hands wouldn't wash away no matter how hard she scrubbed. Though it wasn't really there anymore. Just like Thomas wasn't really there anymore. Buried 6 feet under in the dusty cemetery on the edge of Shafter, Texas, where the desert wind carried away prayers before they could reach heaven. The mine foreman Marcus Webb had looked her straight in the eye at the funeral in September of 1882, and told her it was her fault her husband was dead, that she'd kept him up the night before with her crying about wanting to leave this God-forsaken mining town, that Thomas had been exhausted and careless because of her, and half the town had heard him say it. Sarah stood at the wash basin in the small wooden house she'd shared with Thomas for 3 years, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror above it. She was 24 years old and already a widow, her dark hair pulled back severe from a face that had forgotten how to smile. The morning sun cut through the gap in the curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits, and she wondered if one of them might be Thomas trying to tell her something. The mine whistle blew in the distance, signaling the start of another shift, and her stomach turned at the sound. She hadn't been to the Silver Star mine since the day they'd brought Thomas out on a stretcher, his body broken from a cave in that shouldn't have happened. Marcus Webb had stood at the mine entrance with his arms crossed, shaking his head, and when she demanded to know what had happened, he'd said loud enough for everyone to hear that Thomas had been distracted, exhausted, not paying attention. He'd said Thomas had mentioned that morning that his wife had kept him awake half the night with her complaining. He'd said it was a shame when a man died because his woman couldn't learn to hold her tongue. It was a lie. All of it was a lie. Thomas had slept soundly that night, and Sarah had been quiet as a church mouse like she always was, afraid of disturbing him before his shifts. But Marcus Webb was the foreman, and his word carried weight in Shafter, and soon enough people were looking at her differently in the general store, whispering behind their hands at church, crossing the street to avoid speaking to her. The knock at her door came just as she was contemplating whether she had enough money left to buy coffee. She'd been living off the small savings Thomas had hidden in a tin under the floorboards, but that wouldn't last forever. The mine company had refused to pay her any death benefits, citing negligence on Thomas's part. Marcus Webb had signed the report himself. Sarah opened the door to find a man she'd never seen before standing on her narrow porch. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green, like sage in morning light, and they studied her with an intensity that made her want to close the door. He wore worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a hat he removed the moment he saw her, Mrs. Sullivan. His voice was deep and gentle, nothing like the harsh tones she'd grown accustomed to from the miners. Yes. She didn't open the door any wider. My name is Tucker Zander. I'm a cowboy passing through, but I've been working some odd jobs around town the past week. He turned his hat in his hands, a nervous gesture that seemed out of place on a man who looked like he could handle anything. I heard about what happened to your husband. I heard what the foreman said about you. Sarah's face flushed hot with shame and anger. Then you can move along like everyone else. I don't need your pity. I'm not offering pity, madam. I'm offering information. Tucker's eyes held hers steadily. I was doing some work at the mine office yesterday, fixing a busted door frame, and I overheard some things. Things about your husband's accident that don't match up with what the foreman's been saying. Her heart began to pound. What kind of things? The kind I shouldn't discuss on your front porch where anyone might hear. May I come in? I promise I mean you no harm. You can leave the door open if it makes you feel safer. Sarah hesitated, but something in his face, an honesty she hadn't seen in weeks, made her step aside. Tucker entered the small main room, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe, and she left the door ajar as he'd suggested. He didn't sit even when she gestured to the worn chairs by the fireplace, instead standing respectfully near the window where the light illuminated his angular features. "I heard two of the miners talking when they didn't know I was there," Tucker said quietly. "They were saying the cave-in happened in a section of the mine that Marcus Webb knew was unstable. There'd been complaints about the shoring for weeks, but Webb didn't want to spend the money to fix it proper. He sent men in there anyway, your husband included. When the tunnel collapsed, it wasn't because anyone was careless or tired. It was because the supports were rotted through, and Webb had ignored every warning." Sarah's knees went weak, and she gripped the back of a chair. "Why would he blame me then? Why make up lies about Thomas being exhausted?" "Because if the company admits the mine was unsafe due to negligence, they'd be liable. They'd have to pay you compensation, maybe face criminal charges. But if they can blame your husband, say he was at fault, they don't owe you a cent." Tucker's jaw tightened with anger. "And blaming you specifically, saying you kept him up at night, that's just cruel. It makes you the villain so nobody asks too many questions. Can you prove any of this?" Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. "Can you prove Marcus Webb knew the mine was unsafe?" "Not yet. But I aim to try if you'll let me." Tucker met her eyes again. "I've seen a lot of injustice in my years moving from place to place, Mrs. Sullivan. I've learned to keep my head down and mind my own business because getting involved usually just brings trouble. But something about this situation, about what they're doing to you, it doesn't sit right. I can't ride away from Shafter knowing I didn't at least try to help." "Why?" the question burst from her. "You don't know me. You didn't know Thomas. Why would you risk trouble for strangers?" Tucker was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands again. "My mother was widowed when I was 12. My father died in a logging accident back in Missouri, and the lumber company said it was his fault, said he'd been drinking on the job. He never touched liquor a day in his life, but they had a foreman who backed up their story, and my mother couldn't prove otherwise. She lost everything. We lost everything." His voice roughened with old pain. "I couldn't help her then. I was just a boy. But I'm not a boy anymore, and maybe I can help you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself to cry in front of another person since the funeral. "Even if you find proof, who's going to believe us over Marcus Webb? He runs that mine. He has the company behind him. Then we'll have to be smart about it. We'll need evidence that can't be disputed, and we'll need witnesses willing to talk." Tucker put his hat on the small table. "I'm not saying it'll be easy, Mrs. Sullivan. It might take time, and there's a chance we'll fail, but I'm willing to try if you are." She looked at this stranger who'd appeared at her door like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. Something in her chest, something that had been locked tight with grief and anger, loosened just slightly. "Call me Sarah. And yes, I want to try. I want people to know the truth about Thomas. I want Marcus Webb to answer for what he did. Then we'll start tomorrow. I'll do some more work around the mine, keep my ears open, see what else I can learn. In the meantime, you should write down everything you remember about the days leading up to the accident. Anything Thomas might have mentioned about problems at the mine, concerns about safety, conversations with other miners. It might all be useful." After Tucker left, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, trying to remember details through the fog of grief. Thomas had been a quiet man, not one to complain, but as she focused on those last few weeks, memories began to surface. He'd mentioned that Marcus Webb was pushing the crews harder, trying to extract more silver faster. He'd come home one evening troubled, saying some of the men were worried about a section of tunnel that was making strange creaking sounds. He'd mentioned that one of the miners, a man named Charlie Rodriguez, had refused to work in that section anymore after seeing how bad the rot was in the support timbers. Charlie Rodriguez. Sarah remembered him from church, a family man with 4 children. If he'd complained about the tunnel before the collapse, his testimony could be crucial. But would he be willing to speak up against the foreman? Men with families couldn't afford to lose their jobs, especially not in a town like Shafter where the mine was the only real employer. Over the next week, Tucker became a constant presence in Sarah's life, stopping by each evening after his work to share what he'd learned. He'd gotten himself hired on for regular maintenance work at the mine, which gave him access to areas most outsiders never saw. He was good with his hands, could fix almost anything, and he had a way of being so quiet and unobtrusive that people talked freely around him. "The miners know the truth," Tucker told her one evening as they sat in her small parlor, the lamp casting warm light over the papers spread between them. "Every single one of them knows that section of tunnel was a death trap, but they're scared, Sarah. Marcus Webb has fired men for less than questioning his decisions, and jobs are scarce. These men have families to feed." "What about Charlie Rodriguez?" "Thomas said he'd refuse to work in that tunnel." Tucker nodded slowly. "I talked to Charlie yesterday, carefully so nobody would notice. He did refuse and Marcus threatened to fire him. Charlie backed down, said he'd work wherever he was told. But he wasn't there the day of the collapse because he'd traded shifts with another man. He feels guilty about that, thinks maybe if he'd been there he could have warned everyone before it happened. Or he'd be dead too," Sarah said softly. "That's what I told him." Tucker leaned back in his chair, exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes. He wants to help, but he's terrified of losing his job. His wife is pregnant with their 5th child. I can't blame him for being scared. Sarah studied Tucker's face in the lamplight. Over the past week, she'd learned more about him in scattered pieces of conversation. He was 27 years old, had been cowboying and drifting since he was 15, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. He'd worked ranches from Missouri to Texas, had driven cattle up to Kansas, had seen more of the country than most people ever would. There was a restlessness in him, but also a deep loneliness he tried to hide behind easy smiles and steady competence. "You're good at this," she said. "Getting people to talk to you, finding information. You should have been a detective instead of a cowboy." Tucker's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Cowboys don't need to stay in one place. Detectives do. I'm not much good at staying." "Why not?" The question hung in the air between them. Tucker looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard work. "After my mother lost everything, we moved around a lot. Never had a real home again. I guess I got used to it, started to prefer it even. Can't be disappointed by a place if you never expect to keep it." "That sounds lonely," Sarah said quietly. "It is sometimes." Tucker raised his eyes to hers, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "But this past week, helping you, having a purpose beyond just the next job and the next town, it's made me remember what it felt like to be part of something that mattered." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. It scared her, this connection forming between her and Tucker Zander. It felt like a betrayal of Thomas's memory, even though her rational mind knew her husband would never have wanted her to be alone forever. But it was too soon, too fast, and there was too much at stake. She looked away, breaking the moment. "We should focus on finding evidence," she said, her voice more brisk than she intended. "Without it, nothing else matters. If Tucker was hurt by her retreat, he didn't show it. I've been thinking about that. What we need is documentation. The mine has to keep records of complaints, maintenance issues, safety concerns. If we could get access to those records, We might be able to prove that Marcus Webb knew about the problems and ignored them. Those records would be in the mine office. There's no way to get to them without being caught. Not during the day, no, but at night when everyone's gone. Tucker leaned forward. I've been studying the patterns. Marcus leaves around 7 in the evening. There's a night watchman, but he mostly stays near the mine entrance, not the office building. If someone could get in through the office window, someone small and quiet, they could look through the files. Sarah's eyes widened. You're suggesting I break into the mine office? I'm suggesting we break in. I'll keep watch, handle the watchman if he comes around. You'll be quicker at going through papers, figuring out what's important. Tucker's expression was serious. It's a risk, Sarah. I won't pretend it's not. If we're caught, there'll be consequences. But it might be our only chance to get the proof we need. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd planned together that had been stolen by Marcus Webb's greed and negligence. She thought about the lies being spread about her husband's memory being tarnished to protect the mine company's profits. She thought about all the other miners working in unsafe conditions right now because Marcus Webb cared more about silver than human lives. When? She asked. Tomorrow night. Sunday. The watchman on Sunday nights is old Pete Hendricks, and he's half deaf. He'll be the easiest to work around. They spent the rest of the evening planning, going over every detail until Sarah's head spun with all the things that could go wrong. When Tucker finally left, well past midnight, he paused at the door and looked back at her. You don't have to do this, Sarah. I could try to get in myself, look through the records. No, I need to do this for Thomas. She managed a small smile. Besides, you're right that I'll be quicker at sorting through papers. Thomas always said I had a mind for details. He was a lucky man. Tucker said it softly, and before Sarah could respond, he'd settled his hat on his head and disappeared into the darkness. Sarah barely slept that night or the next day, her nerves stretched tight as piano wire. She dressed in dark clothing Sunday evening, her hands shaking as she braided her hair and pinned it close to her head. Tucker arrived just after sunset, also dressed in dark clothes, and together they made their way through the quiet streets of Shafter toward the mine. The Silver Star mine sat on the edge of town, a sprawling complex of buildings and equipment that looked sinister in the moonlight. The main shaft descended into the earth like a mouth ready to swallow anyone foolish enough to enter. Sarah had always hated this place, even before it had killed her husband. Now she loathed it with every fiber of her being. Tucker led her around the perimeter, staying in the shadows until they reached the office building. It was a simple wooden structure, smaller than Sarah's house, with 2 windows facing the desert. Tucker had already loosened one of the windows during his maintenance work, and it opened silently at his touch. Remember, look for anything dated in the 3 months before the accident. Complaints, repair requests, inspection reports, anything that mentions tunnel stability or support structures. Tucker cupped his hands to give her a boost up. I'll be right here. If you hear me whistle twice, it means someone's coming and you need to hide. 3 times means get out immediately, any way you can. Sarah nodded, her mouth too dry for words. She placed her foot in Tucker's linked hands, and he lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing. She grabbed the window frame and hauled herself through, dropping quietly to the floor inside. The office was dark except for moonlight filtering through the windows. Sarah waited for her eyes to adjust, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the watchman would hear it from across the compound. Slowly, shapes emerged from the darkness. A desk, filing cabinets, a safe in the corner, shelves lined with ledgers and papers. She started with the filing cabinets, moving as quietly as possible, reading labels by the faint moonlight. Personnel files, shipping records, Or assay reports, nothing useful in the first cabinet. The second cabinet held maintenance records, and Sarah's pulse quickened. She pulled out the drawer labeled with the current year and began flipping through files. There. A complaint form dated June 15, 1882, 3 months before Thomas died. It was signed by Charlie Rodriguez and 2 other miners, detailing concerns about rotted support timbers in the East Tunnel's lower section. Sarah's hands trembled as she read Marcus Webb's response, scrawled at the bottom of the form in heavy black ink. Supports adequate for current operations. Request denied due to budget constraints. Miners will continue assignments as directed. She found another complaint dated July 3rd, this one from a different miner, describing creaking sounds and visible cracks in the tunnel ceiling. Marcus's response was even more dismissive. No structural issues identified. Miners advised to focus on production rather than unfounded concerns. August 12th, another complaint. August 20th, another. All of them about the same section of tunnel, all of them ignored or denied by Marcus Webb. Sarah felt sick as she realized how many warnings there had been, how many chances to prevent the tragedy that had killed Thomas and 2 other men. She was gathering the papers, trying to figure out how to carry them all when she heard it. Tucker's whistle, 2 sharp notes. Someone was coming. Sarah froze, the papers clutched to her chest. She looked around frantically for a hiding place. The desk was too exposed, the space behind the filing cabinets too narrow. There was a closet in the corner, and she darted toward it, pulling the door shut just as she heard voices outside. Thought I saw something near the office. It was Pete Hendricks, the night watchman. Probably just a coyote, but figured I should check. I'll take a look with you. That was Tucker's voice, casual and helpful. I was just taking a walk, couldn't sleep. Too hot in the boarding house. Sarah held her breath in the stuffy darkness of the closet. Through the crack in the door, she could see lantern light playing across the office windows. The door handle rattled and she pressed herself back against the wall, certain she was about to be discovered. Locked up tight, Pete said. Like I thought, just a coyote. They come around sometimes looking for scraps. Probably right, Tucker agreed. This heat makes everyone jumpy. Say, Pete, you've been working here long. The voices faded as Tucker skillfully led the watchman away from the office, talking about the weather, the mine, anything to keep the old man distracted. Sarah waited in the closet for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes. Finally, she heard the signal. One low whistle, the all clear. She emerged from the closet, her legs shaking, and made her way back to the window. Tucker was there, his face tight with worry in the moonlight. Did you find anything? He whispered. Yes, more than I hoped for. Sarah handed the papers through the window, then climbed out herself, not as gracefully as she'd entered. Tucker caught her as she stumbled, steadying her with his hands on her waist. For a moment they stood frozen, close enough that Sarah could feel the warmth of him, smell the scent of soap and leather and something uniquely him. Then Tucker released her, stepping back, and they hurried away from the mine into the protective darkness of the desert. They didn't stop until they reached Sarah's house, both of them breathing hard from the fast walk and the aftermath of fear. Inside, Sarah lit a lamp with shaking hands and spread the stolen papers on her kitchen table. Tucker leaned over her shoulder reading, and she heard his sharp intake of breath. This is it. This is exactly what we needed. His voice was rough with emotion. Sarah, these documents prove Marcus Webb knew the tunnel was unsafe and did nothing. He's liable. The mine company is liable. This changes everything. Sarah sank into a chair, the reality of what they'd done and what they'd found washing over her. What do we do now? We can't exactly take stolen documents to the sheriff. No, but we can make copies, document everything. Then we return the originals before they're missed. Tucker pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Tomorrow's Monday. Marcus will be in the office by 6 in the morning. We need to have these back before then. That's less than 6 hours from now. Then we'd better start copying. They worked through the night, Sarah's neat handwriting transcribing every word of every complaint and response, while Tucker kept watch by the window, alert for any sign of trouble. As the sky began to lighten toward dawn, Sarah copied the last line of the last document, her hand cramping from hours of writing. "Finished," she said, flexing her fingers. Tucker gathered the original documents carefully. "I'll get these back into the filing cabinet. You stay here, get some rest." "I'm coming with you." Sarah stood, ignoring the exhaustion that made her bones feel like lead. "We're in this together." Something in Tucker's expression softened. "Together, then." They made their way back to the mine in the gray pre-dawn light, moving quickly and quietly. The window was still unlocked, and this time Tucker went through it himself, his lean frame fitting through the narrow opening with surprising ease. Sarah kept watch, her heart in her throat, until he emerged a few minutes later. "Done. Everything back where you found it." Tucker pulled the window closed, making sure it latched. "Now we need to figure out our next move." Back at Sarah's house, they sat at the kitchen table, exhaustion and exhilaration making Sarah feel light-headed. The copied documents were stacked neatly between them, evidence of Marcus Webb's negligence in Sarah's careful handwriting. "We need a lawyer," Tucker said. "Someone who can use this evidence to build a case against the mine company, force them to admit liability. There's no lawyer in Shafter. We'd have to go to Fort Davis or maybe even El Paso." Sarah rubbed her eyes. "And lawyers cost money I don't have. I have some saved up. It's not much, but it might be enough to at least get someone to listen." Tucker reached across the table and took her hand before he seemed to realize what he was doing. He started to pull back, but Sarah tightened her fingers around his, needing the comfort of human contact, of his contact specifically. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you've done. You've risked so much for someone you barely know." "I know you, Sarah." Tucker's thumb moved gently across her knuckles. "Maybe not for long, but I know you're brave and determined and you love your husband enough to fight for his memory even when the whole town's against you. I know you're stronger than you think you are. And I know that helping you is the most important thing I've done in a long time, maybe ever." Sarah felt tears well up, not the bitter tears of grief that had been her constant companion, but something warmer, more complicated. "Tucker, I need to tell you something. I'm grateful for your help, more grateful than I can say, but I'm also confused because what I'm starting to feel for you, it seems wrong. Thomas has only been gone 2 months. I shouldn't be feeling anything for anyone, least of all a man I just met." Tucker was quiet for a long moment, his gray-green eyes searching her face. "Can I tell you what I think? I think grief doesn't follow a schedule. I think your husband, from what you've told me about him, sounds like he was a good man who loved you and would want you to be happy. And I think that maybe we met each other at exactly the time we were supposed to." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I've been alone a long time, Sarah. I chose to be alone because it was easier than risking getting hurt. But these past couple weeks, working with you, talking with you, seeing your strength and your kindness even in the middle of your own pain, it's made me want to stop running. It's made me want to stay in Shafter." Sarah's heart was beating fast again, but this time it had nothing to do with fear. "Stay with you. If you'll have me. Not right now, I know it's too soon. But eventually when you're ready, if you're ever ready." Tucker squeezed her hand gently. "I'm not asking for promises, Sarah. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I'm worth taking a risk on." Sarah looked at their joined hands, at this man who'd appeared in her life like a miracle just when she needed one most. She thought about Thomas, about the love they'd shared, and she knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't want her to be alone forever. He'd want her to live, to be happy, to find love again if she could. "I think I'd like that," she whispered. "When this is over, when we've gotten justice for Thomas, I'd like to see where this might go." Tucker's face broke into a smile, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed him from handsome to heartbreaking. "Then let's finish what we started. Let's take down Marcus Webb and get you the justice you deserve." They spent the next day resting and planning. Tucker used his contacts from his travels to send telegrams to lawyers in Fort Davis and El Paso, explaining the situation in careful terms. By late afternoon, they'd received a response from a lawyer named James Thornton in Fort Davis, who was willing to review their evidence and consider taking the case. "He wants us to come to Fort Davis. Bring all the documentation," Tucker said, reading the telegram. "Says if the evidence is as strong as we claim, he'll represent you on contingency, meaning he doesn't get paid unless we win. Fort Davis is a 2-day ride from here." Sarah bit her lip. "If I leave town, people will talk. People are already talking. Let them." Tucker folded the telegram carefully. "We can take the stage, be there and back within a week. Sarah, this is our chance. We have to take it." She knew he was right. The next morning, Sarah packed a small bag, locked up her house, and met Tucker at the stage office. A few townspeople stared as they boarded the stage together, and she could see the judgment in their eyes. A widow traveling alone with a man who wasn't her husband, barely 2 months after her husband's death. The scandal would be all over Shafter by nightfall. Sarah lifted her chin and climbed into the stage without looking back. The journey to Fort Davis took too long, dusty days with an overnight stop at a way station where Sarah and Tucker had separate rooms and carefully maintained propriety, despite the stage driver's knowing looks. They talked for hours during the journey, Sarah sharing stories about her life before Thomas, her childhood in Louisiana, her dreams of someday opening a dress shop. Tucker told her about the places he'd been, the things he'd seen, the vast loneliness of the open range that had felt like freedom until he'd realized it was just another kind of prison. Fort Davis was larger than Shafter, a proper town with tree-lined streets and well-kept buildings. James Thornton's office was above the general store, and the lawyer himself was a surprise. Young, maybe 30, with keen dark eyes and an intensity that reminded Sarah of Tucker. "Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Zander, please sit down." Thornton gestured to chairs in front of his desk. "I've been thinking about your case since I received your telegram. Mine safety negligence resulting in death is serious business, but it's also difficult to prove, especially against a company with resources and influence. We have proof." Sarah set the copied documents on his desk. Complaints from multiple miners about unsafe conditions, all ignored by the mine foreman Marcus Webb. The accident happened in the exact section of tunnel that had been reported as unstable. Thornton spent an hour reading through the documents, occasionally making notes, his expression growing more interested with each page. Finally, he looked up at Sarah and Tucker. "This is good. Very good, in fact. You say these are copies of original documents still in the mine's possession?" "Yes. We couldn't remove the originals without them being missed." Tucker leaned forward. "Will they hold up in court even as copies? If we can get miners to testify that they filed these complaints and that the foreman ignored them, yes. The testimony combined with the documentation would be powerful evidence." Thornton tapped the papers thoughtfully. "The challenge will be finding miners willing to testify. The mine company will fight this hard, Mrs. Sullivan. They'll try to discredit you, intimidate witnesses, drag your reputation through the mud. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah thought about Thomas, about his smile and his kindness and the future they'd never have. "I'm prepared for whatever it takes. Then I'll take your case. I'll need you to sign some papers, and then I'll start preparing a lawsuit against the Silver Star Mining Company and Marcus Webb personally for negligence resulting in wrongful death." Thornton's smile was sharp and determined. "I've wanted to take on the mining companies for years. They've been getting away with murder, quite literally, for too long. Let's show them they can't anymore." They spent the rest of the day in Thornton's office, going over every detail of the accident, Thomas's employment history, the complaints and warnings that had been ignored. By the time they finished, Sarah's voice was hoarse and her head ached, but she felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. That evening, Tucker insisted on buying her dinner at the town's only restaurant, a pleasant place with checkered tablecloths and food that tasted like heaven after months of Sarah's grief-numbed cooking. "We did it," Tucker said, raising his glass of water and a toast. "We got you a lawyer, a good one. This is really happening, Sarah. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Sarah clinked her glass against his. "You saved me, Tucker, not just from Marcus Webb's lies, but from drowning in grief and anger. You gave me purpose again. You saved yourself. I just helped a little." But Tucker's eyes were warm, and when he reached across the table to take her hand, Sarah didn't pull away. They returned to Shafter 3 days later, and the town was buzzing with gossip about their trip. Sarah's landlord, Mr. Peterson, was waiting on her porch when they arrived. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to talk to you about your lease," he said, not meeting her eyes. Sarah's stomach sank. "What about it?" "I'm going to need you to vacate the property by the end of the month. I'm sure you understand, with your circumstances and all the talk, it's just not appropriate for you to continue living here." "My circumstances? You mean being a widow who had her husband stolen by mine negligence?" Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "Or do you mean the talk spread by people who'd rather believe a lie than stand up to the mine foreman?" Peterson shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Mrs. Sullivan, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You have 2 weeks to find other arrangements." After he left, Sarah stood on her porch, shaking with anger and despair. Where was she supposed to go? She had barely any money left, no family in Texas, no prospects. "You'll stay with me." Tucker spoke from behind her. "I've been renting a room at the boarding house, but Mrs. Chen, who runs it, has a small cottage out back she's been trying to rent. It's modest, but it's clean and private. You can stay there, and I'll help with the rent until the lawsuit settles and you get your compensation." "Tucker, I can't let you do that. People already think the worst of me, of us. If you're supporting me financially, living in adjacent properties, they'll say I'm your mistress or worse. Let them say whatever they want. I don't care about their opinions, and you shouldn't either." Tucker turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Sarah, these people abandoned you when you needed them most. They believed lies about you without question. Why should their judgments matter now?" He was right, Sarah realized. The town had already convicted her in their minds. She might as well commit the crime she'd been accused of, in a manner of speaking. She might as well take the help being offered and stop caring what Shafter, Texas thought of her. "All right, thank you, again." The cottage behind Mrs. Chen's boarding house was small but charming, with a tiny kitchen, a bedroom just big enough for a bed and dresser, and a sitting area with windows that looked out on a scrubby garden. Mrs. Chen, a kind Chinese woman whose husband had worked on the railroad before his death, charged a fair rent and didn't ask intrusive questions. She seemed to understand what it was like to be a widow in a hostile town. Sarah moved in at the end of October as the weather turned cooler. Tucker helped her transport her meager belongings, and she found herself settling into a strange new routine. Tucker continued his work at the mine, carefully maintaining his cover while gathering any additional information that might help their case. In the evenings, he'd stop by Sarah's cottage, and they'd have dinner together, talking about the lawsuit, about their pasts, about the future they were both starting to imagine. James Thornton sent regular telegrams updating them on the lawsuit's progress. He'd filed the complaint in district court, naming both Marcus Webb and the Silver Star Mining Company as defendants. The mine company had hired expensive lawyers from Houston who were already trying to get the case dismissed, arguing that Sarah had no standing to sue, that the statute of limitations had passed, that the company bore no responsibility for accidents that resulted from worker negligence. "They're trying every legal trick in the book," Tucker said one evening in late November, reading the latest telegram. "But Thornton says the judge hasn't dismissed anything yet. That's a good sign." Sarah was cooking dinner, a stew that filled the small cottage with savory smells. Over the past month, she'd started to feel more like herself again, the constant weight of grief lifting gradually. She would always miss Thomas, would always carry the love they'd shared, but she was learning that she could honor his memory and still move forward with her life. "Tucker, can I ask you something?" She stirred the stew, not looking at him. "When this is over, when the lawsuit is settled one way or another, are you planning to stay in Shafter?" There was a long pause. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you want me to stay." Tucker came to stand behind her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence like warmth from a fire. "Sarah, I know we said we'd wait until this was over to talk about what's between us, but I need you to know something. I'm not helping you because I expect anything in return. If you tell me tomorrow that you want me to leave once the lawsuit is done, I'll go and I won't hold it against you. But if you tell me you want me to stay, if you tell me you feel even a fraction of what I feel for you, then I'm never leaving. I'm done running." Sarah set down the spoon and turned to face him. They were inches apart in the tiny kitchen, and she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she might reject him. This man who'd been so brave, who'd risked everything to help her, was terrified that she might not want him. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I've been trying not to because it seemed too soon, too fast, too complicated. But Tucker, somewhere between breaking into that mine office and riding to Fort Davis and cooking dinner in this cottage, I fell in love with you. I don't know how it happened so quickly, but it did." Tucker's breath caught. "Sarah, I know Thomas would want me to be happy. I know he'd like you, actually. You're both good men, honorable men, different in some ways but similar in the ways that matter." Sarah reached up to touch Tucker's face, feeling the roughness of stubble under her palm. "I'll always love Thomas, but I love you too, and I don't think that's wrong. I think maybe hearts are bigger than we realize." Tucker pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she held him back just as fiercely. They stood like that for a long moment, two lonely people who'd found each other in the midst of tragedy and somehow built something beautiful from it. When Tucker finally pulled back enough to see her face, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I love you, Sarah Sullivan. I love your strength and your courage and your stubborn refusal to give up even when everyone was against you. I love the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating and the way you hum while you cook and the way you see the best in people even when they don't deserve it." Sarah laughed, a sound of pure joy that startled her. When had she last laughed like that? "I love you too, Tucker Zander. I love the way you always remove your hat indoors and the way you're kind to everyone, even people who don't notice it, and the way you've made me believe in happy endings again." Tucker kissed her then, a gentle kiss that tasted of promise and new beginnings. Sarah kissed him back, letting herself feel all the things she'd been holding at bay. Hope and desire, and the thrilling possibility of a future with this man who'd appeared in her life like an answered prayer. The stew nearly burned while they stood in the kitchen kissing, and they broke apart laughing, Sarah grabbing the pot off the stove while Tucker opened the windows to let out the smoke. It was imperfect and chaotic and absolutely perfect, and Sarah felt like she was finally, truly alive again. December brought cold winds and the first real developments in the lawsuit. James Thornton telegraphed that he'd succeeded in getting 3 minors to agree to testify. Charlie Rodriguez and 2 others who'd filed complaints about the unsafe tunnel. The mine company had tried to intimidate them, but Thornton had obtained a court order protecting them from retaliation. The trial is set for January 15th, Tucker read from the telegram. Thornton wants us back in Fort Davis a few days before to prepare. January. That's less than 6 weeks away. Sarah felt nervous anticipation flutter in her stomach. This is really happening. We're going to face Marcus Webb in court, and we're going to win. Tucker pulled her close, a gesture that had become natural and necessary for both of them. The evidence is solid, we have witnesses, and Thornton is a good lawyer. Justice is coming, Sarah, for you and for Thomas. But Marcus Webb wasn't going down without a fight. A few days after they received the telegram, Sarah was walking back from the general store when Marcus himself stepped into her path. It was the first time she'd seen him up close since the funeral, and the sight of him made her blood run hot with anger. Mrs. Sullivan. I hear you've been causing trouble. Marcus's voice was cold and hard. Filing lawsuits, making accusations. That's not wise. What's not wise is sending men into unsafe tunnels and then blaming their widows when they die. Sarah lifted her chin, refusing to show fear. I have proof of your negligence, Marcus. Documents, witnesses. The truth is going to come out. Truth is whatever people believe it to be, and people believe what I tell them. Marcus stepped closer, trying to intimidate her with his bulk. You think you'll win this lawsuit? Even if you do, you think anyone in this town will ever speak to you again? You're already a pariah, Sarah. Keep pushing this, and you'll have nothing left. I'd rather have nothing but the truth than everything built on lies. Sarah stood her ground even though her heart was pounding. You killed my husband through your negligence. You killed 2 other men, and you blamed me to cover your own guilt. But it's over now, Marcus. You're going to face justice. Marcus's face flushed angry red. You stupid woman. Do you think the mining company will just let you destroy their reputation? Do you think I'll let some widow and her cowboy lover ruin me? I'll crush you. I'll make sure you regret ever crossing me. That's enough. Tucker's voice cut through the confrontation like a knife. Sarah hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly he was there, inserting himself between her and Marcus. You've threatened Mrs. Sullivan, and I'm a witness to it. You want to add that to the list of charges against you? Marcus looked at Tucker with contempt. The drifter cowboy playing hero. You're making a mistake getting involved in this, Xander. When I'm done with her, I'll make sure you never work in this county again. I don't care about working in this county. I care about Sarah, and I care about making sure men like you can't get away with killing people through your greed and negligence. Tucker's voice was calm but edged with steel. The trial is in 6 weeks. You'll have your chance to defend yourself then. Until then, stay away from Sarah. Marcus glared at them both but backed down, perhaps sensing that Tucker wouldn't be as easy to intimidate as a grieving widow. He walked away, and Sarah released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Thank you, she said to Tucker. I thought I could handle him, but he's more frightening up close than I remembered. He's a bully who's been getting away with his behavior for too long, but bullies always fold when someone stands up to them. Tucker took her hand, squeezing gently. Come on, let's get you home. As Christmas approached, Shafter was transformed by decorations and the forced cheer of the season, but Sarah felt disconnected from all of it. Last Christmas, Thomas had been alive, and they'd spent a quiet evening in their small house, exchanging modest gifts and dreaming about the future. This year, everything was different. Tucker seemed to sense her melancholy on Christmas Eve. He showed up at her cottage with a small package wrapped in brown paper and a smile that made her heart lift despite her sadness. "I know this is a hard time for you," he said, setting the package on her table. "I know you're missing Thomas and you're worried about the trial, but I wanted to give you something to remind you that you're not alone anymore." Sarah unwrapped the package to find a beautiful shawl, soft wool dyed a deep blue that reminded her of twilight. It must have cost Tucker a significant portion of his savings, and tears filled her eyes at the thoughtfulness of it. "It's perfect. Thank you." She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, feeling the warmth of it and the love that had prompted the gift. "I have something for you too, though it's not as fine." She gave him a shirt she'd sewn herself, working on it in secret during the evenings when he wasn't there. It was simple but well made, practical for his work, and when Tucker put it on she saw that it fit him perfectly. "Nobody's ever made me anything before," Tucker said quietly. "Thank you, Sarah, I'll treasure it." They spent Christmas evening together in Sarah's cottage, cooking a simple meal and talking about Christmases past. Tucker told her about holidays when he was young, before his father died, when his family had been happy and whole. Sarah shared memories of Louisiana, of her mother's Creole cooking and her father's terrible singing of carols. "Next Christmas will be better," Tucker promised as the evening drew to a close. "The trial will be over, you'll have your settlement, and we can start fresh. Maybe we'll even be married by then if you'll have me." Sarah's heart stuttered. "Tucker Xander, was that a proposal?" Tucker's eyes widened, as if he hadn't quite realized what he was saying until the words were out. Then he smiled, that wonderful smile that transformed his face. "I suppose it was. Not a very good one, I know. I should probably get down on one knee, find a ring, do it properly. I don't need proper, I just need honest." Sarah moved closer to him, taking his hands in hers. "Ask me." Tucker took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "Sarah Sullivan, I know we haven't known each other long, and I know the timing isn't perfect. I know you're still grieving the husband you lost, and I'll never try to replace him or make you forget him. But I love you with everything I am, and I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to support your dreams and share your burdens and make you laugh when you're sad. Will you marry me? Not right away, but someday when you're ready." "Yes." The word came out clear and certain, without hesitation. "Yes, Tucker, I'll marry you. Not right away, you're right about that. But someday soon. After the trial, after we've gotten justice for Thomas. Then we can start our new life together with a clear conscience and an open future." Tucker pulled her into his arms, and they held each other as snow began to fall outside, rare in West Texas but magical when it came. It felt like a blessing, like the universe approving of their promise to each other. The new year arrived with cold winds and mounting tension as the trial date approached. James Thornton sent a detailed telegram outlining what Sarah could expect. The mine company's lawyers would attack her character, question her motives, suggest she was after money she didn't deserve. They'd try to make the jury see her as a greedy widow rather than a victim of corporate negligence. "Let them try," Sarah said grimly. "The truth is on our side." They left for Fort Davis on January 10th, taking the stage in weather that was unseasonably cold even for winter. This time, Sarah wore a ring Tucker had bought her, a simple gold band that marked them as engaged. Let the town gossip. After the trial, they'd likely leave Shafter anyway, start fresh somewhere that didn't carry so many painful memories. James Thornton met them at the stage office, his expression serious. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Sullivan. The mine company's lawyers are good, and they've been preparing their defense for months. But we have the evidence, and we have witnesses who are willing to tell the truth despite the risks. If the jury is fair, we'll win." The trial began on a freezing January morning in the Fort Davis courthouse, a stern stone building that seemed to promise justice just by its solid construction. Sarah wore her best dress, black for mourning, and Tucker sat in the gallery directly behind her, a silent source of strength. The mine company's lawyers were everything Thornton had warned: slick and aggressive, twisting facts and casting doubt wherever possible. They painted Thomas as a careless worker who'd ignored safety protocols. They suggested Sarah had been a difficult wife who distracted her husband from his duties. They implied she'd filed the lawsuit purely for financial gain, not justice. Sarah sat through it all, her hands clenched in her lap, forcing herself to remain calm and dignified even as they tore apart her reputation and her husband's memory. Tucker's presence behind her was the only thing that kept her from standing up and screaming the truth at them. Then it was Thornton's turn. He methodically presented the copied documents, showing the pattern of complaints that had been ignored. He called Charlie Rodriguez to the stand, and the miner testified with quiet dignity about the rotted supports, the dangerous conditions, Marcus Webb's refusal to address safety concerns. "I told Foreman Webb that tunnel was going to collapse," Charlie said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "I told him someone was going to die if he didn't fix those supports. He said I was being dramatic, said I could work where I was told or find another job. I have 4 children and another on the way. I couldn't afford to lose my job, so I backed down. But I knew. We all knew that tunnel was a death trap." 2 more miners testified to the same effect, corroborating the complaints and Marcus Webb's dismissive responses. The jury listened intently, and Sarah began to feel the first stirrings of hope. Then Marcus Webb himself took the stand, and Sarah's anger burned white-hot as she watched him lie under oath. He claimed the complaints had been exaggerated, that he'd inspected the tunnel personally and found it sound, that Thomas Sullivan had been tired and careless the day of the accident due to domestic troubles at home. "I tried to send him home that day," Marcus said, looking directly at the jury with false sincerity. "I could see he wasn't focused, but he insisted on working, said he needed the money because his wife was always complaining they didn't have enough. If I could go back, I'd have forced him to take the day off. Maybe those 3 men would still be alive." Thornton cross-examined him ruthlessly, catching him in contradictions and forcing him to explain why. If he truly thought the tunnel was safe, 3 other men had also filed complaints about it. Marcus grew flustered, his answers less smooth, and Sarah could see doubt creeping into some of the jurors' expressions. The trial lasted 3 days. On the final day, Sarah herself took the stand, and Thornton gently guided her through her testimony about Thomas, about the night before the accident, about the lies Marcus Webb had told. "Did you keep your husband awake the night before he died?" Thornton asked. "No. Thomas slept soundly that night. He always did before work days. I was always careful to be quiet to let him rest." Sarah's voice was steady, though tears streamed down her face. "I loved my husband, Mr. Thornton. I would never have done anything to put him in danger, and Marcus Webb knows that. He lied about me to cover up his own negligence, and he's lied in this courtroom to try to escape responsibility for killing 3 men. The mine company's lawyer tried to rattle her on cross-examination, but Sarah held firm, answering every question honestly and calmly. She could feel Tucker's support from the gallery, could feel Thomas's spirit beside her, urging her on. In his closing argument, Thornton laid out the case with precision. Documented complaints ignored, minors intimidated into silence, safety protocols violated in the name of profit, and 3 men dead as a result. He held up the copied documents, the proof of Marcus Webb's negligence, and asked the jury to deliver justice not just for Sarah, but for every minor who'd ever been put at risk by corporate greed. The mine company's lawyer countered with arguments about the inherent dangers of mining, worker responsibility, and the lack of evidence that Marcus Webb had acted with malicious intent. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Sarah spent that time in a small room adjacent to the courtroom, unable to eat or think or do anything but wait. Tucker sat with her, holding her hand, occasionally murmuring reassurances that she barely heard through the roaring of blood in her ears. Finally, the bailiff came to tell them the jury had reached a verdict. Sarah walked back into the courtroom on shaking legs, Tucker at her side though he had to sit in the gallery once they passed through the gate. She took her seat next to Thornton, who squeezed her hand briefly in encouragement. The jury foreman stood, a weathered man who'd probably worked with his hands his whole life. "We the jury find in favor of the plaintiff, Sarah Sullivan. We find that the defendants, Marcus Webb and the Silver Star Mining Company, acted with negligence that directly resulted in the deaths of Thomas Sullivan, Robert Chen, and Miguel Torres. We award the plaintiff compensation in the amount of $5,000, plus court costs." The courtroom erupted in noise. Sarah heard none of it. She sat frozen, unable to process what she'd just heard. They'd won. They'd actually won. Thornton was shaking her shoulder, smiling broadly. "Sarah, we did it. You did it. Justice for Thomas." Sarah turned to look back at Tucker, who had tears running down his face. He mouthed the words, "I love you," and she mouthed them back, her own tears finally falling freely. Marcus Webb's face was purple with rage as the judge formally entered the judgment and ordered the mine company to pay the settlement within 30 days. The mine company's lawyers were already talking about appeals, but Thornton assured Sarah that with such clear evidence and testimony, an appeal was unlikely to succeed. Outside the courthouse, in the cold January air, Tucker swept Sarah into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "You were amazing in there," Tucker said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "You were so strong and calm and honest." "I was so proud of you." "We were amazing," Sarah corrected. "Tucker, without you, none of this would have happened. You found the evidence, you believed in me when nobody else did, you gave me the courage to fight. This victory belongs to both of us." James Thornton joined them, shaking both their hands. "Congratulations. This is a significant win, not just for you but potentially for other miners' families. You've proven that the mining companies can be held accountable. Other widows may follow your lead." The thought that Thomas's death might lead to better safety conditions for other miners, might save other lives, filled Sarah with bittersweet satisfaction. It wouldn't bring her husband back, but it gave his death meaning beyond the senseless tragedy it had seemed. They stayed in Fort Davis for 2 more days while Thornton handled the paperwork and filed additional motions to prevent the mine company from retaliating against the miners who'd testified. The settlement money would take a few weeks to arrive, but when it did, Sarah would be financially secure for the first time since Thomas's death. On the stage ride back to Shafter, Sarah leaned against Tucker's shoulder, exhausted but deeply content. "What do you want to do now?" she asked him. "We could leave Shafter, start over somewhere new. I have enough money to open that dress shop I used to dream about, maybe in a bigger town where there'd be more customers." Tucker was quiet for a moment, his arm around her shoulders. "I want whatever you want, Sarah. If you want to stay in Shafter, we'll stay. If you want to leave, we'll leave. If you want to open a dress shop or a boarding house or become a cattle rancher, I'll support you. The only thing I'm sure about is that I want to be wherever you are. Then let's leave. There are too many painful memories in Shafter, and too many people who believe the worst about me. Let's go somewhere new, somewhere we can build our life together without the past hanging over us." Sarah lifted her head to look at him. "What about Fort Davis?" "It's a nice town, big enough to support a dress shop, but not so big it's overwhelming. And James Thornton is there if we ever need a lawyer again. Fort Davis sounds perfect." Tucker kissed her forehead gently. "We could get married there too, start our new life officially. After a proper mourning period. Another few months, maybe. I want to honor Thomas's memory, but I also want to start living again." Sarah smiled up at him. "Is that terrible of me? It's human, it's healthy, and I think Thomas would approve." Tucker's eyes were soft with understanding. "We'll do everything right, Sarah. We'll honor the past while we build the future." They returned to Shafter in late January to a decidedly mixed reception. Some people congratulated Sarah quietly, acknowledging that she'd been treated unfairly. Others, particularly those dependent on the mine for their livelihoods, saw her as a troublemaker who damaged the company's reputation. Marcus Webb himself had been fired by the mining company in an attempt to distance themselves from the lawsuit, and he'd left town in disgrace, which gave Sarah deep satisfaction. Over the next 2 months, Sarah and Tucker prepared for their departure from Shafter. Sarah sold her furniture and possessions, keeping only what they could transport easily. Tucker gave notice at the mine and the other odd jobs he'd been working. They made plans to marry in Fort Davis on April 15th, a year and a day after Thomas's death, a span of time that felt both respectful and right. The night before they left Shafter, Sarah visited Thomas's grave alone. She knelt beside the simple headstone and placed wildflowers on the ground, speaking to her husband as if he could hear her. "I got justice for you, Thomas. Marcus Webb paid for his negligence and the mine company did too. I hope that gives you peace, wherever you are." She traced the letters of his name carved in stone. "I also want you to know that I'm leaving Shafter. I'm leaving with Tucker, and we're going to get married and start a new life together. I hope that's all right. I hope you understand that loving him doesn't mean I love you any less. You'll always be my first love, the man who taught me what it meant to be cherished. But Tucker is my future, and I think you'd like him. I think you'd be happy that I'm not alone." The wind whispered through the cemetery, and Sarah chose to believe it was Thomas giving his blessing. Tucker was waiting for her at the cemetery gate, and together they walked back through Shafter one last time. They'd be taking the morning stage to Fort Davis, leaving this chapter of their lives behind. Mrs. Chen was waiting at the boarding house with a package of food for their journey and tears in her eyes. "You are a brave woman," she said, hugging Sarah tightly. "You stand up for truth when everyone else look away. I admire you so much." Charlie Rodriguez and his wife came by as well, bringing a small gift of embroidered handkerchiefs that Charlie's wife had made. "Thank you for what you did," Charlie said. "The mine company is making changes now, fixing the unsafe areas, listening to complaints. You saved lives, Mrs. Sullivan. Maybe even mine." The next morning, Sarah and Tucker boarded the stage with a single trunk of possessions and a future full of possibilities. As Shafter disappeared behind them in a cloud of dust, Sarah felt the last weight of grief and anger lift from her shoulders. She was free. She was loved. She was alive. Fort Davis welcomed them like a homecoming. They rented a small house near the center of town, and Sarah began the process of opening her dress shop while Tucker found work at a nearby ranch. The settlement money arrived in March, and suddenly, Sarah had the capital to stock her shop properly, buy quality fabrics and sewing supplies, advertise her services. Their wedding on April 15th was a simple affair at the Fort Davis church, with James Thornton and his wife as witnesses and a handful of friends they'd made during their time in town. Sarah wore a dress she'd sewn herself, pale gray to acknowledge her widowhood, but with blue embroidery that symbolized hope and new beginnings. Tucker wore a new suit that made him look almost unbearably handsome, and when he said his vows, his voice shook with emotion. "I promise to love you and honor you all the days of my life," Tucker said, holding both her hands in his. "I promise to support your dreams and share your burdens. I promise to be faithful and true, to make you laugh when you're sad, to hold you when you're afraid, to stand beside you through whatever life brings. You've made me believe in home again, Sarah. You are my home." Sarah's own vows came through tears. "I promise to love you with my whole heart, today and always. I promise to be your partner in all things, to support you as you've supported me, to build a life with you full of joy and purpose. You saved me when I was drowning, Tucker. You gave me hope when I had none. I love you more than I can express, and I'll spend the rest of my life showing you." They exchanged simple gold rings, kissed to the applause of their small gathering, and began their marriage with joy and hope. The dress shop, which Sarah named Sullivan's Fine Clothing in honor of both Thomas and her new married name, opened in May and quickly became popular. Sarah had a gift for understanding what women wanted, for creating dresses that were both beautiful and practical. She employed 2 seamstresses within the first year, and the business thrived beyond her expectations. Tucker continued working at the ranch, but began to develop a reputation as a skilled horse trainer. Men came from miles around asking him to work with their difficult horses, and gradually he built his own business alongside Sarah's. They worked hard, saved carefully, and built a life together that was full of purpose and love. A year after their marriage, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated mix of joy and sadness. She would have loved to give Thomas children, but that future had been stolen. Now she was carrying Tucker's child, and while she was deeply happy, she also felt the old grief resurface. Tucker held her while she cried, understanding without words that she was mourning what could have been even while celebrating what was. "It's all right to feel both things," he told her gently. "Thomas was part of your life, part of who you are. This baby is a blessing, but it doesn't erase the past. We carry all of it with us, the joy and the sorrow." Their son was born in February of 1884, a healthy baby with Tucker's gray-green eyes and a surprisingly loud cry. They named him Thomas Sullivan Zander, honoring Sarah's first husband and ensuring his memory would live on in the next generation. Holding her son, watching Tucker cradle the baby with infinite gentleness, Sarah felt complete in a way she'd never expected to feel again. The pain of losing Thomas would always be part of her, a scar on her heart that had healed but would never disappear. But that scar didn't prevent her from loving fully, from embracing the life she'd built with Tucker. Over the years, their family grew. A daughter named Mary arrived 2 years after Thomas, followed by another son, Jacob, 2 years after that. The dress shop expanded to include a men's clothing section, and Tucker's horse training business flourished. They bought a house on the edge of Fort Davis with room for their growing family and Tucker's horses. They returned to Shafter only once, years later, to visit Thomas's grave and ensure it was well maintained. The town had changed. The Silver Star mine had been sold to new owners who implemented strict safety protocols. Marcus Webb had died in a bar fight in El Paso, a bitter end to a bitter man. Some of the people who'd shunned Sarah apologized when they saw her, prosperous and happy with her family. Others looked away, ashamed. Sarah stood at Thomas's grave with her 3 children, telling them about the man whose name their oldest brother carried. "He was kind and good, and he loved me very much," she told them. "He would have loved you all too. I was lucky to have known him, even though our time together was too short." Tucker stood slightly apart, giving her space for this private moment with her past, but little Thomas ran to his father and demanded to be picked up. Tucker lifted his son, and Sarah's heart swelled with love for this man who honored her history while creating new memories with her. That evening, as they prepared to leave Shafter for the last time, Sarah looked back at the town that had brought her so much pain and, ultimately, so much growth. She'd arrived here as Thomas Sullivan's young wife, full of dreams that had been shattered by tragedy and injustice. She was leaving as Sarah Zander, a successful businesswoman, a mother, a woman who'd fought for justice and won, who'd rebuilt her life from ashes and found love again. "No regrets?" Tucker asked, his arm around her waist as their children played nearby. "Not one," Sarah said firmly. "Every moment, even the terrible ones, led me to where I am now, led me to you, to our children, to the life we've built. I wouldn't change any of it, not if it meant losing what we have." Tucker kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of promise and permanence. "I love you, Sarah Zander. I loved you from the moment I saw you standing in your doorway, brave and broken and determined to find the truth. I'll love you until my last breath and beyond. I love you too, always." They climbed into their wagon, children settled in the back, and left Shafter behind one final time. The setting sun painted the desert gold and crimson, and ahead of them the road stretched toward Fort Davis, toward home, toward the rest of their lives together. Sarah leaned against Tucker's shoulder, her hand resting on his knee, and felt perfect peace. Years continued to unfold in gentle succession. The dress shop became one of the most successful businesses in Fort Davis, and Sarah began training her daughter Mary in the art of dressmaking when the girl showed both talent and interest. Tucker's horse training reputation spread across Texas, and he was eventually offered a partnership in a ranch that bred and trained horses for the Army and for wealthy cattlemen. Their children grew strong and happy, raised with stories of both Thomas Sullivan's goodness and Tucker Zander's courage. Young Thomas inherited his namesake's gentleness and his father's skill with animals, eventually taking over the horse training business. Mary became a talented seamstress and designer who expanded the dress shop into a full clothing emporium. Jacob, the youngest, surprised everyone by becoming a lawyer, inspired by stories of James Thornton's fight for justice on his mother's behalf. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Tucker gave Sarah a leather-bound book filled with pages he'd written over the years, recording their life together. Stories of their courtship during the lawsuit, their wedding, the birth of each child, the growth of their businesses, the 1,000 small moments that made up a life of love and partnership. "So we never forget," Tucker said, his hair now silver at the temples but his eyes still that distinctive gray-green that had captured her heart so many years ago. "So our children and grandchildren will know how we found each other, how we fought for justice, how we built something beautiful from tragedy." Sarah read through the book with tears streaming down her face, reliving their journey from that first meeting on her porch in Shafter to this moment, surrounded by family and success and love. "It's perfect. You're perfect. This life we've built is perfect, even with all its imperfections." Their grandchildren arrived in time, children of their children, and Sarah and Tucker grew old together with grace and gratitude. They never forgot Thomas Sullivan or the injustice that had brought them together, but they also never let the past overshadow the present. They lived fully, loved deeply, and built a legacy that extended far beyond themselves. On a warm spring evening in 1910, when Sarah was 52 and Tucker was 55, they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the Texas sky. Their children were grown with families of their own. The businesses were thriving in the next generation's capable hands, and life had given them more blessings than Sarah had ever imagined possible during those dark days after Thomas's death. "Do you ever think about how different life could have been?" Sarah asked, her hand in Tucker's as it had been for thousands of evenings before. "If Marcus Webb hadn't blamed me, if you hadn't stopped to help, if we hadn't found that evidence." "Sometimes," Tucker admitted. "But I prefer to think about how things are, not how they could have been. I think about how lucky I am that I happened to be in Shafter that September, that I heard about your situation, that I had the courage to knock on your door. I think about how you trusted me, believed in me, loved me. I think about the life we've built and the family we've created, and I'm grateful for every moment. Even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. They made us who we are. They taught us what matters." Tucker lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I love you, Sarah. I've loved you for 28 years, and I'll love you for however many more we're